The question to start with is, how can digital services be designed and implemented to enhance capabilities of governments to serve residents more effectively, but also more equitably?
Okay, thank you very much, moderator. So this is a very interesting topic and particularly a very interesting question on how digital service could be designed to be able to serve the citizen. So I'll give you an example, particularly in Rwanda, how we digitize public service or digital service to be able to get accessed by citizen. So from a technical point of view, you did mention something around the design. So while designing digital services, we start by taking care of how do we develop digital services by taking into consideration the user-centric design. How do we make sure that whatever we are doing is easier for citizens to be able to access the service? That is one aspect which we look at from a design point of view. Second one is how do we make sure that whatever digital service we are putting in place is actually accessible by citizens. So we are talking about the accessibility of services through digital device. So as in Rwanda, we have different initiatives that tackle this particular issue, where we look at every segment of citizen and make sure they have device to actually consume those services. Another aspect is when we design the digital services, we design them in a such way that they are easy to use, but we also actually train citizens to uplift their digital literacy skills to be able to consume the services. So in a nutshell, this is how we tackle this issue of digital service development.
Well, you said one of my favorite terms, which is user-centered design, which is it's not common vernacular, right, for like local and governments to really kind of be able to approach that user-centered design. Specifically when you're thinking about, it's not about digitizing everything, right? It's about digitizing the things, number one, that are most critical, prioritizing those things, and then understanding what the user's needs are. But you also talked a little bit about teaching users how to really take advantage of the service, because I think digital literacy is a big component, because we can digitize a lot of things, but if our user really doesn't understand really how to go through that process, then those efforts really kind of go unnoticed, unused, et cetera. So I really appreciate that Rwanda is taking that user-centered approach. I mean, in technology companies, that is status quo, that is what they do, and so it makes me happy to see that governments are taking that approach as well, because that is the industry standard, and that's the way to do things. Tom, you share your perspective with us. I mean, obviously from the Smart Cities Council, you have a global view of that, so tell us.
Yeah, look, so I guess following that theme, it is very much about the user and about the outcomes, and starting with that in mind. So for us, Smart Cities, the mission is to build a safer, more beautiful, enabled, equitable, resilient and sustainable world for everyone. So a bit of a mouthful, but it is, I guess, trying to pick up on the key elements there, and they're not about particular solutions or particular technologies, but about the outcomes that we're trying to achieve for the citizens and for the communities more broadly. So for us, that means using technology, but using technology for good. So some core principles for us are things like secure by design, and focusing on the capabilities that need to be built out as foundations rather than, again, the solutions. So that's about building capabilities across government, industry and academia, and recognising that they all play a part in building robust, resilient, sustainable communities. And so from a smart cities perspective, what we're seeing particularly, there are, I guess, some key focus areas. So that all need to kind of come together somewhat cohesively. So that's transportation, so smart transportation, tourism, health, education, and then obviously the economic elements of that. So using smart cities as an enabler to build better economic outcomes for those communities as well.
Well, I like that you kind of mentioned bringing everyone to the table, because I think that's the only way that we achieve a smarter, more resilient, more responsive city, is by having all of the stakeholders in the conversation. I think that that's what Smart Cities Council does a good job of, is not just, I think when you think of Smart Cities 1.0, kind of, it was very device focused. It was about sensors. It was about data. It was about technology, and the technology got put first. And then the technology got deployed into the public realm, and it wasn't always accepted by the public or really understood. And so there's over the last decade, there's been this effort to educate the consumer, which is a little bit reactive, right? And so now I think I like that people are taking, number one, the collaborative approach and getting everyone to the table, and then taking that user-centric approach to make sure that everyone is brought up to speed on technology versus getting left behind. Yeah. So thanks for sharing that perspective. Roberta, would love to hear your perspective.
Thank you so much. So I do think the two gentlemen have touched on a lot of the baseline. So if you think around this idea of design thinking that you spoke about, and the need for training and understanding of the technology. But I represent Gijima, which is the large system integrator in South Africa. And so I think for us, what we've been able to do is really work on the back end. While yourselves will deploy the initiative on the front end from a consumer base, our job is to really look at the entire ICT landscape of government and to ensure that there's an integration around that. So all those stakeholders come together in the end state, have a data pool that is integrated. I think a big mistake is to ensure that you don't just have this siloistic approach where you don't have a bigger agenda for what the smart city play looks like in the greater South African government. And so for us, that has been imperative in essentially actualizing that on the ground.
Wonderful. And it's important also to do that behind the scenes work, because I think that is kind of where the rubber meets the road, right? It isn't just about the tech deployment, but it's what you're doing on the back end to make sure that it's all being done properly and implemented in the way that serves everybody. Yeah. Isabel, would love to hear the UN Habitat perspective for sure.
Thanks, Albi. I think if you're not familiar with UN Habitat, we are the cities agency of the United Nations system. And of course, a big part of what we do is we advise governments all around the world on different issues related to cities. And in my particular case, it's around people-centered smart cities. And so one way that we are supporting local governments in particular is we have developed so-called playbooks on people-centered smart cities. One of them is on privacy and security issues, because we realize that a lot of cities kind of lack a step-by-step approach on how they could address the issue around digitizing services, but then also related issues that they have to consider around privacy, data storing, etc. And so to your question now, I think there's sort of three things I want to highlight now briefly. One is that a city, before digitizing and before using digital tools or technologies to assess and use data effectively in a local government, cities have to establish digital service standards. And so these are kind of uniform commitments across all of the digital services provided by a city that cover privacy, interoperability, equity, and security issues. And so we have just heard earlier issues on data and also UX. Those are all part of these open standards that ideally a city should create. And then different service providers and also tech companies that might come into the mix then will be able to adhere to those standards. And so that is something extremely important. And then the second point is around building what we call a civic tech stack. And so that gives cities an idea of where to start with the kind of services that they should actually offer to citizens and different service providers. And so there, I think what is important is that a city knows how to address issues around digital identity, payments and then also exchange of data. Because when you're dealing with things around issuing permits, licenses, providing records, city records, or validating user IDs, etc., that is a necessity. And that also helps now citizens and the users of these digital tools to build trust and to kind of have that feedback loop of is this still useful to me, or can this be optimized, etc. And then the third one is that it is very important for cities to build capacity and governance for their digital transformation. And so when you build digital tools at a local government level or new city level or so, you have to also think about the maintenance and support of the management structure of these digital tools. If that is not there, it may not be driven by demand, but by other factors that are probably not sustainable. And so you have to build that capacity and training system into it so that these systems can be sustainable in the long run.
Excellent. I think capacity building is going to be a theme for some of the questions I'm going to follow up on. So I think we're going to double click on that because I think everyone here kind of owns some component of capacity building in their organization or kind of in the broader ecosystem. But we'll go over to you, Joel, and get your perspective from UCLG Africa.
Okay. So for those who don't know, UCLG Africa stands for United Cities and Local Government Africa. So this is an umbrella body that advocate for local government leadership across the 54 countries, and there are about 16,000 members. And the mandate is actually to promote best practices among cities and so forth. And in 2015, before our flagship summit called AfriCity Summit, we actually took an initiative to say, okay, in the next 5 years, we want all cities and subnational government to be fully digitized in terms of their processes, their workflow, and to serve their residents better. So 3 objectives were set in Johannesburg, AfriCity. One was the UCLG Africa itself to have all their regional offices to be transformed and develop policies on digital transformation. Secondly, the subnational government, local government itself needs to be capacitated to scale up their workflow and workforces into digital transformation and to develop policy to that effect. And the third one is to be able to use those type of platforms that help residents within their cities to engage effectively and also maintaining their building and infrastructure in terms of facilities and different class of asset set for cities. So fast forward, 2022, we had the AfriCity 2022 in Kisumu, in Kenya, and we show a prototype of what could be the ideal model using software, a cloud system, to digitize the whole infrastructure of subnational government and local government. And that's what we've been doing in terms of helping different cities using smart tools and technology for effective governance and also to be able to engage their residents.
Got it. Well, and I know one of the pillars for UCLG Africa is knowledge and learning. So I think that is a big component, obviously, of capacity building, is really ensuring that you're bringing people together. Obviously, you've got not just AfriCities, but you have several convenings where you really kind of focus on that knowledge transfer and ensuring that everyone's there. But I think even just maybe to rewind a little bit when we talk about capacity and knowledge is really kind of understanding how do we prioritize what services. I think I talked about a little bit about that earlier. So what I wanted to get from you, Rodriguez, is how is Rwanda evaluating and prioritizing what services to digitize? And then second to that, and we'll open that part up to the group, is then how do you build capacity to be able to deploy the services?
Yeah, thank you very much. So in Rwanda particularly, the way we actually prioritize the service to be digitized, I will first of all maybe tell the audience how we understand the services. So there are almost 3 types of services. There are services that are government to citizen. There are those that are government to business. Then there is intergovernmental agencies services, where particular agents of government can serve another particular government agents in a way. So the way we define our priority is basically we start by looking at what are the pain points of citizens. So that implies that we start by government to citizen services. Those are the ones that we give more priorities. Then government to businesses, because we understand the value that the private sector play in an economy. And then lastly, we tackle the government to government services to create the efficiency in the way the government operates. That is, in a summary, how we prioritize the government services when it comes to digitization. Now, you've just mentioned the issue of how do we ensure that whatever services that we're putting in place, it is more of inclusive. How do we ensure that no one is left behind? So from a government point of view, this is something that we started right from the beginning when we are trying to, when the government led an effort to put in place the digital infrastructure. So we deployed a nationwide fiber across all the 30 districts of the country, up to different borders. And we made sure that that connectivity reaches even those remote areas, instead of only laying it within the cities, so that at the end of the day, people living in the remote area are able to have access to that particular infrastructure. So that is one aspect of inclusivity. Another one is I touched a base on this particular one a little bit before, is now we understand the capability of our citizens. How do we make sure they have access to these services? So for people to access the service, they need a device. And we're talking about device, there is an issue of affordability. How do we, as a government, subsidize the access to device, to affordable device, so that even the poor people who cannot afford the device, at least they can have access to these cheaper devices? That is also another aspect. Another aspect is the way we design services. How do we design the service to the extent they are not only accessible by people who have laptop or have smartphone, but they are also accessible with people who are still using feature phone. So people living in Rwanda, they know how different services can be accessed through USSD. That is the issue of inclusivity. So that people who, by the way, I must mention, we have got 93% of phone penetration, out of which more than 65% are still using feature phone. So as you can understand, if we design services that can only be consumed using laptop, using a smartphone, then there is a big chunk of citizens who are left behind. So that is also another aspect which we look at things. And another one is the building the capability of citizens. So however much we are putting in place, we are digitizing services, we are putting everything online, but do our people have that capability to apply for a particular service on themselves? So what do we do as a government? So there is a program of training people on how to consume these services on one hand, but on the other hand, because we understand this is something that might take time, so we deployed around 4,000 actually, agent network across the country who can actually help a citizen who does not have that capacity to apply and get the service online, but they can look for an agent who is around, and the agent can be able to support the citizen to apply and have access to those services. So those are the kind of initiative that we have as a government to be able to say we are putting everything online to bring efficiency, but at the same time, we are making sure everybody is included. Yeah.
Well, it's great to see that Rwanda is also prioritizing digital infrastructure and connectivity infrastructure as much as they're doing into hard infrastructure, because I think those two things go hand in hand. I also think you brought up a good point too. It's one thing that we do as cities sometimes is that we assume access and we assume connectivity when we're building out that digital infrastructure. Is we have to kind of step back a little and say, is everybody connected? And if they are connected, do they have a device so they can connect and consume the services? I think it's kind of part of that user-centered approach, right, is understanding your customer and understanding your user. So, for me, that is as important as the investments that we are making into hard infrastructure. I want to jump over to Roberta because I think you have, kind of a view of the continent. You have a little bit of a lens into that. So kind of taking from what Rodrigue just mentioned. So what do you think, what are you seeing the priorities for digitization just kind of across the region?
Yeah. Just before I go, I think it's important to add that as it's imperative to ensure that people have the mobile devices to be able to connect to these services, you equally need to ensure that on the back end, there's enough infrastructure that allows for that connectivity to happen. And I think you're very right around the training. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, both in the understanding of technology, but also from an entrepreneurship perspective, young, youthful individuals, encouraging them to build businesses of the future that rely on digital economy and not the traditional base, because that's where we'll really see the push into the new Africa that we dream of. So you ask around the priorities of digitalization across the continent. And, I think there's a lot, and there's a lot of things that we all need to come together to do. But for me, the cornerstone of that is an infrastructure. And for today's answer, I think I want to touch on what I call the backbone of infrastructure, so the traditional sense of infrastructure, and one of our businesses and how we address that. And then, of course, from the technological standpoint. So I think if you think around the backbone, for example, in the DRC, one of our companies, the Guma Group, which is a turnkey solution, Pan-African conglomerate provider into the continent, we've sat down and really partnered with the government to look at road infrastructure. What we know about the DRC, if anyone has been there, is that it is large, right? It is a huge country in itself. And so the inaccessibility of the movements and supply chain in that country continues to be a hindrance, no matter how much they want to live within this digital age. And so there's a deep need to ensure that we have logistical infrastructure. And of course, I think it's important to speak around energy. In South Africa, we have an energy crisis that continues to roll forward. And so we've made huge investments, not only looking at solar, but this idea of private electricity selling and how can we use agriculture to really churn out electricity so we can have activity within smart security or smart cities, better yet. I think from the digital perspective, Albie, one needs to look at networking and connectivity, and our organization partners with OEMs to be able to build those trenches. I think there was a gentleman who spoke around, in South Africa, the waterfall solution and the deep trenching around that connectivity. It continues to be something that we need to get right. So really building that layer of baseline. And then I think I want to focus on data centers. We know that we all want to speak around this data-driven economy and data-driven decision-making. And so where we're seeing a gap is, while there's huge investments in the metropolitan areas, not enough of that is going into the rural sectors. And so as Gijima, we've really positioned ourselves to be able to roll out sovereign clouds that both look at urban areas as well as rural areas. So we ensure that no matter what systems are deployed across the base, they have one central baseline where they all come together and we're able to mine that data. I think it's important to think of all the deployments as one holistic ecosystem in the end, and through the deployment of both technology as well as the infrastructure, we're able to land where we want to see the country. Thanks.
Got it. Now, staying on this same theme, so we've heard Rodrigue and Roberta kind of share the priorities and needs, both from Rwanda but at the region. So Isabel, how do you see the role of UN Habitat in kind of creating frameworks and standards for how we deploy these things, and how we kind of, I think it's important to have like centralization and uniformity, so everyone's kind of speaking the same language and approaching the solution in the same way. So how is UN Habitat kind of putting that all together to create frameworks and standardization for deployment?
Thank you, Albie. Before I get to the answer to that, I just wanted to also highlight one publication that we launched last year. It's a global review on smart city governance practices. And what was interesting, so we interviewed over 250 cities and many more respondents as well. But we wanted to understand where cities are at with regards to smart city practices. And actually what is interesting is that there was a couple of stats that came out. For instance, one, there's generally, cities generally struggle, or respondents even across academia and civil society, etc., with ethical issues around digital tech. So that shows that there's a lack of solid regulatory frameworks around what smart cities actually look like or could look like. Then also there was about 78% of the respondents that said there was limited engagement of residents in any kind of government smart city initiatives. And so that shows now, on top of maybe ethical issues around the tech that is used, it also shows that there's not so much people's representation and participation in the kind of initiatives that are already there. On top of that, a third of the respondents also said that data sharing practices between municipal governments and private companies are quite low or non-existent. And so that is another point that is interesting, because here we have a lot of people from private sector sitting in this room. We don't have a lot of people from public sector sitting in this room, yet we are talking about new cities and new cities that will significantly impact this continent. And so these stats are just to illustrate that there's a need for some kind of universally agreed norms on people-centered smart city practices, which is exactly what UN Habitat does. And so now to respond to your question, we are currently in the process of developing international guidelines on people-centered smart cities. So this is a process that has been driven by the 193 member states, of which I think everyone in this room is a part. And we are the drafting authority together with experts from the member states that have been nominated. And so this is a process that obviously takes a little bit of time, because this is a lot of governments that have to agree on the content of it. But it is a kind of crucial moment, because I think for the first time now we are trying to get to a universally agreed definition on smart cities. And that is a definition that puts people at the center of it all. And that means that we are leaving nobody behind. We're not developing any kind of new smart city visions and so on without thinking about what the use of that is for people who are living in those cities and who will be using those cities. And so that is something that is happening at the international level. On top of that, we are engaging in different kind of initiatives also at the international level to bring mayors up to speed on opportunities for digital cooperation. And one of that is that we recently launched a global alliance of mayors on digital cooperation, exactly for the purpose of bringing together different cities for sharing lessons, sharing learning, sharing existing resources, new resources, etc. And that helps cities to optimize the way that they are doing business, and not having to start from scratch every time, but maybe also learning from others and really using that as a shared platform. And then just to round off, what we are also doing, of course, is we're providing a lot of technical advice at the national and city levels as well, where when cities and governments come to us, we can respond to their needs and say, sure, we can help you design smart city governance strategies, master plans, etc. But I think I just wanted to highlight the international level, because this is where I think we have most impact, because it affects all of us.
Well, and so carrying on that same conversation, so Tom, taking what we know that like UN Habitat and other groups are developing in terms of frameworks and standardizations, how do you see the role of Smart Cities Council in sharing some of these best practices? And I see Smart Cities Council as like a megaphone, right,
Yep.
for best practices. And so what's the council doing to make sure that this is all being shared globally and the knowledge transfer is happening region to region, continent to continent, country to country, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think from a smart cities perspective, it's very much echoing those sentiments of that these need to be driven from pattern-based solutions that are built from the right principles and right foundations, and that they're built on best practice, but that it's kind of I liken it to the analogy, a rising tide raises all ships. So
Yeah.
I think collectively, the best outcomes come from from having the broadest community and having, I guess, a breadth of understanding of the best use cases, where sort of standards and policy and governance particularly have been applied really well and for the best outcomes, and then connecting that community, so through government, through industry particularly. So, where are there technology solutions that might be able to be deployed? We've got partners in the network that are delivering, governance, risk and compliance solutions holistically across governments like CAMS, and I think then we've got Activator, which is a solution that we've seen deployed holistically from a sort of a design plan and report. I think the key is, and picking up on a few of the themes, is data is key, but transparency, being able to report that back to the community. Not only are you engaging them, but you're then showing how you've understood that engagement, and then being able to actively throughout the development of these cities report back with transparency and build and maintain that trust that the outcomes that you've committed to are actually the outcomes that are being delivered, that there's robust governance around that in terms of how decisions are being made, how money is being spent, again, and elevating that from a reporting and transparency perspective.
We talk a lot about thinking globally and acting locally. So how does UCLG Africa ensure that all of that information is making its way down to local cities here in the region?
Okay, so what we've been doing for the past 5 years is to develop a digital knowledge hub. So it's a peer-to-peer learning for all mayors or cities across the continent, and we divided it into the 3 regions, and they can actually go online and log in and actually discuss policies framework, digitization framework for subnational government and local government. So they actually learn within the regions, because we have regional dynamics that is quite different when you take the whole continent. So we take the East Africa community and see what is the best practice in terms of policies that can work in that region, and you cannot take the same thing and copy and paste to the North Africa. So we actually develop frameworks with partners, and they have that peer learning among themselves. One of those are developing some kind of reporting. How do you engage your citizen in terms of giving them, like my colleague was saying, transparency. What is the city doing for the citizens? Because at the moment, you see people sending an email, and it could take a month for, if you are lucky, you get a response from the same people that are supposed to be serving them. So we actually also try to promote and campaign for that two-way communication and be able to engage the citizen. One thing we picked up is capacity, because the practitioners, the public service practitioners, they themselves do not understand the kind of technology that is being used. We're talking about simple things like email, and sometimes they have their own way of doing things, and first you have to get the buy-in for them to understand that actually there are smart tools that will help them effectively engage their citizens. So we've developed different programs for the past 5 years, and what we're doing is capacitating and bringing them and upscaling the staff members within the local, because you can only pitch what you've mastered. So if you don't know what you've mastered, how can you go to the public and tell them to use digital platform when you don't know how to even respond to them? So that's that two-way kind of approach.
Well, I'm glad you're talking about upskilling too, because now the next thing is the future's here, right? So now, how are we thinking about integrating emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, massive data transfers, much better connectivity? How are we using that and harnessing those tools to better serve our public? So we'll start with you, Rodrigue. And since we only have a couple minutes, if you have something to add to what Rodrigue is about to say, then just raise your hand and I'll call you. But Rodrigue, is Rwanda already exploring emerging technologies into the public service realm?
Yeah, so we haven't adopted so much of them, but we understand that these emerging technologies are here to create value on how we serve the public. So, for instance, we've understood that the deployment of IoT technologies, we are talking about sensors across the cities, then the city management are able to collect the data, which then they can use AI and machine learning to predictively be able to say what are the kind of trend that we can see, and we are able to do informed policies and the strategies. So this is how we, as a government, we understand the adoption of these technologies. So we see the value if we deploy various solutions as part of a smart city initiative, and we are able to improve the way we are doing our things. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about continuous improvement. I mean, anyone want to share just what they're kind of seeing in terms of future of technology and how that's going to help us better serve people?
I mean, maybe I can just respond. What needs to happen is there needs to be certain kind of different steps in place before you can even start building the capacity of local government officials. Because it is true, I mean, you find a lot of small local governments that don't even have the hardware, let alone software, or even IT professionals that know anything about how to build digital tools or use them effectively. And so that is something that all boils down to: how do you build that capacity at the local government? We can help, we can provide trainings, and many other organizations do the same, and that's quite important. But now, before you start thinking about the trainings, cities can put in place certain things to do that more effectively. So one is, for instance, pick an advisory group. As a city, you can have advisors who can advise and guide you on what is the latest technology, what are some of the things to consider, what are some of the risks that cities have to understand before they adopt certain digital tools, for instance. Leadership, how do you build that leadership? I think that boils down to the point on capacity as well. Buy-in from policy. So does a city already have a policy in place that supports what the city is trying to do? Or is that at the national government, and can it be translated to the local government? How do you build in user feedback? So when a lot of citizens may actually have tools that are useful or could contribute to the tools that a city wants to develop. And so that is important. And then communities of practices. So there's many different kind of feedback loops that can be built into thinking about digital tools for better local capacity building and governance.
Got it. Robert, I think you had a thought. I'll give you 10 seconds to do it in rapid pace.
Okay, great. I just think it's important to call out that, as we see developments of ICT and digitalization across the continent, what we're sometimes seeing is governments saying that they have deployed a digitalization strategy, but in fact, all that they've done is digitalizing part of the segment and not the entire value chain. And so there's a great importance as we upskill government officials into understanding what the entire breadth of digitalization looks like, is to ensure that we are deploying that so we're able to deliver for the people on the ground, right? I think for me, another thing that remains important is that as we build these ecosystems and we have policies that frame what that is, from a mainframe perspective, countries, cities need to be able to know who their partner is. But the application layer of what that journey looks like needs to be flexible enough because the startup economy in Africa is robust. There's solutions happening every single day that can solve our short-term and long-term challenges. And so as we look at what that infrastructure play looks like, we need to know that our mainframe is set and solid and the security, cybersecurity will sort, but we need to remain flexible so we're able to, from a regional, continental basis, really be able to start to address the challenges we have. Thanks.
What a great way to end this panel. I could go on forever. I feel like we're just getting started with the discussion, but time is up. And so I just want to give a round of applause for our panelists who shared their